The observation deck of the Infinite Reach was a place of cold beauty. A vast, curved window of transparent alloy stretched from floor to ceiling, framing the stars in a panorama that had once filled Commander Thallon with pride. Tonight it filled him only with dread. He stood alone at the glass, 6 long fingers pressed against its surface, watching the distant light of battle. Each flash was brief, a white bloom against the endless black, and each one marked the end of something that would never return. A ship, a crew, hundreds of minds and bodies, each one irreplaceable, consumed by the advancing hunger of the Krell. Thallon was old by Veltoran standards. He had served in the fleet for 4 centuries, long enough to have watched empires rise and crumble at the edges of the Collective's vast domain. He had fought in 20 campaigns, put down rebellions on distant colonies, negotiated the surrender of aggressive species who had mistaken the Collective's patience for weakness. In all those years, across all those battles, he had never once known the particular hollow feeling that had settled into his 3 hearts over these past months. Defeat. The Veltoran Collective had ruled the galaxy for 12,000 years. Their civilization spanned 10,000 star systems, stretching from the dense, stellar nurseries of the core to the cold, drifting outposts at the galactic rim. They had brought order to chaos, carried knowledge to primitive worlds, and woven the diverse tapestry of 100 species into something resembling unity. They had endured plagues, civil wars, and the slow entropy of time itself. But the Krell were something different. They had emerged from the outer darkness 3 centuries ago, not as a species seeking territory or resources, but as something more fundamental and more terrifying. They were transformation itself. They did not want to conquer, they wanted to convert. Every ship they destroyed became raw material for more of themselves. Every world they swept across was stripped bare, its biomass folded into the ever-growing swarm. The Krell did not negotiate. They did not retreat. They did not understand mercy, because mercy required the imagination of an alternative. For the Krell, there was only the swarm, and the swarm had only one direction: forward. For 300 years, the Veltoran fleet had held them. Barely. Expensively. At a cost in lives that Thallon had stopped trying to calculate because the numbers had grown too large for grief to contain. Now they were no longer holding. His silver skin caught the starlight, and his reflection stared back at him from the viewport. An old soldier watching fires in the distance, unable to extinguish them. Commander. The voice belonged to Junior Officer Sareth. She was barely a century old, which by Veltoran reckoning made her little more than a child in uniform. Her dark charcoal skin and wide eyes gave her an appearance of perpetual alertness, though tonight that alertness had curdled into something closer to fear. She held her data tablet with both hands to keep them from trembling. "Report," Phelan said without turning from the window. "We have lost contact with the defensive stations in Sector 9. Her voice was careful, measured, the voice of someone delivering news they wished they didn't have to speak. The Krell broke through the line approximately 2 standard hours ago. Early estimates placed the number of stations destroyed at 47, with total casualties exceeding 200,000. Thallon closed his eyes. 200,000. The number pressed down on him like a physical weight. He had learned, long ago, that commanders could not afford to feel every death individually. That was the quickest path to paralysis. But the weight accumulated anyway, settling into the bones over the years, carried silently until it became simply part of what one was. "And the reinforcement fleet from the core worlds?" he asked. Sareth hesitated. In his experience, hesitation before a number meant the number was worse than expected. "Still 5 days away, Commander." 5 days. He turned the calculation over in his mind with the grim efficiency of long practice. The Krell, unimpeded, would reach the colony worlds of the Outer Rim in 3. Worlds that had known nothing but peace for generations. Cities that had stood for thousands of years. Libraries containing the accumulated knowledge of 100 civilizations, meticulously preserved and endlessly expanded. Families who had never once imagined that the war at the galaxy's edge might one day arrive at their doorstep. All of it measured against 5 days and 3 days in the cold mathematics of distance and speed. "Thank you, Sareth," he said. "Return to your station." She left without another word, which he appreciated. There was nothing to say. Thalon remained at the viewport, watching the distant blooms of light, and allowed himself a few more moments of private despair before he would need to become a commander again. He had almost managed to compose himself when the voice of senior analyst Krath cut through the quiet hum of the command deck. "Commander." The word carried a quality Thalon had learned to recognize over the years. Not alarm, exactly, but the controlled urgency of a veteran who had encountered something outside the framework of his experience. "I think you should see this." Thalon moved to the sensor station. Around him, officers stopped what they were doing and turned, drawn by the same instinct that draws attention to anything genuinely unprecedented. Krath was one of the finest sensor operators in the fleet, a methodical, unflappable analyst whose instincts Thalon had learned to trust completely. The look on his face now was not one Thalon had ever seen before. On the holographic display above the console, a small contact had appeared at the very edge of the system. It pulsed softly, like a heartbeat. "What are we looking at?" Thalon asked. "A vessel, sir. It entered the system approximately 4 minutes ago." Krath paused, and in that pause Thalon heard the weight of something enormous. It came through the broken zone. Silence fell across the entire command deck. The broken zone was a region of space that the Veltorn Collective had designated impassable 9 centuries ago, following the loss of 18 exploration vessels sent to map it. It was a scar in the fabric of the cosmos, a tangle of gravitational anomalies, radiation storms, and spatial tears that made conventional navigation not merely dangerous, but impossible. Physics itself became unreliable in the broken zone. Ships that entered it did not return. Eventually, the collective had stopped sending them. "That is not possible," Thalon said. The words came out automatically because they were simply true. "I have verified the readings 3 times, Commander." Kraft's voice was steady, but Thalon could see the tension in the set of his shoulders. "The vessel transited the broken zone and emerged on this side undamaged. Our sensors confirm it." Thalon leaned over the display. The contact was small, perhaps 1/10 the mass of a Veltorn cruiser. Its configuration was unusual, even elegant. Smooth, sweeping curves quite unlike the angular, utilitarian architecture of Veltorn warships. It didn't match anything in his memory. "Run the design through the database," he said. Krath was already doing so. The Collective's database was among the most comprehensive repositories of knowledge in the galaxy, containing detailed records of every spacefaring species encountered over 12,000 years of exploration and expansion. If this ship belonged to a known civilization, the database would find it. It took less than 30 seconds. "Sir," Kraft's expressions shifted into something between confusion and disbelief. "I have a match. The design corresponds to a species first observed approximately 300 years ago. Designation, human. Their home planet is called Earth." The word landed strangely. Human. Fallon knew the species, in the way one knows background details in a story that isn't really about them. Humans were among the Collective's more recent observations. A young, energetic civilization that had achieved basic interstellar capability within the past century or so. They were notable mainly for their brevity, short-lived, biologically fragile, and possessed of a technological level that, while advancing, remained far below anything the Collective would consider significant. They had been flagged for monitoring and then, as happened with so many developing species, quietly filed away while the collective attended to more pressing matters. That had been 3 centuries ago. A human vessel, Thalon said slowly, coming through the broken zone. Yes, sir. Our last intelligence on human technology suggested they lacked the capability for long-range hyperspace travel. That was 3 centuries ago, Commander. Fallon absorbed this. Open a channel. Let's find out what we're dealing with. The main display filled with the interior of the unknown vessel, and Thalon found himself looking at a creature he had never encountered in person. The human was smaller than he had expected, perhaps half his own height, with a slender frame that looked almost impossibly fragile by Veltoran standards. 2 eyes positioned symmetrically on a rounded face regarded him with an expression of calm attentiveness. Her skin was pale, her hair dark and short, and she wore a uniform of deep blue with gold emblems at the shoulders. She sat in her command chair with the posture of someone who had absolutely nowhere else she needed to be. Not tense, not defensive, not performing the careful diplomatic neutrality that most species adopted during first contact. Just present, relaxed, almost comfortable. It was, Thalon thought, one of the stranger things he had witnessed in 4 centuries of command. Most species, upon finding themselves suddenly hailed by a Veltoran flagship, became either terrified or excessively formal. This human looked as though she had dropped by for a conversation she had been looking forward to. When she spoke, the ship's translation systems rendered her words in clean, precise Veltoran. Greetings. I am Captain Sarah Chen of the Earth vessel Pathfinder. I hope my arrival hasn't caused any concern. Fallon kept his voice measured and authoritative. You have entered Veltoran collective space. Identify your purpose immediately. The human, Captain Chen, smiled. It was an expression Fallon recognized from the collective's cultural files on the species, and this one read as genuine rather than performative. Of course, Commander. I'll get straight to it. We've been monitoring the situation in this region for some time, and it's clear that your collective is facing a serious threat. We thought we might be able to help. Fallon stared at her for a moment. You wish to assist the Veltoran collective. That's correct. He clasped his hands behind his back, drawing on the reserves of composure that centuries of command had built in him. Do you understand who we are, Captain Chen? The Veltoran collective has governed this galaxy for 12,000 years. We have integrated or superseded over 1,500 civilizations. Our military technology represents the pinnacle of 12 millennia of continuous development. The idea that a single human vessel could offer us meaningful assistance is admittedly surprising, I understand. Her tone was pleasant, unhurried. And I don't mean to be presumptuous, Commander, but I noticed that despite those considerable accomplishments, your defensive lines in Sector 9 collapsed 2 hours ago. Your reinforcement fleet is 5 days away, and there are currently 4 billion Veltoran citizens on the Outer Rim worlds who will likely run out of those 5 days before your fleet arrives. She said it without cruelty, simply as a statement of observed facts. But the precision of her knowledge hit Thalon like a cold wind. She knew about Sector 9. She knew about the reinforcement fleet's timeline. She had been watching. Our affairs are not your concern, he said, though with fractionally less certainty than he'd intended. I recommend you leave collective space immediately. Commander. Her expression shifted. Still calm, still courteous, but something had changed behind her eyes. I traveled to the broken zone to reach you. That is not a journey undertaken lightly, and I didn't make it to be turned away without a conversation. I'd ask you to hear me out before making any decisions. Before Thalon could respond, Krath's voice came from behind him, sharp with urgency. Commander, the human vessel's power output is increasing. How significant? A beat of silence, then, Sir, The energy signature exceeds that of the infinite reach. Thalon turned sharply. Run the measurement again. I have, sir, 3 times. The readings are consistent. Krath looked up from his console, and what Thalon saw in his expression was not the analytical confusion of a sensor operator encountering faulty data. It was the wider-eyed look of someone whose understanding of what was possible had just shifted. The Pathfinder is generating more power than our flagship. On the display, Captain Chen seemed to read his reaction with the ease of someone who had anticipated it. Your sensors are accurate, Commander. I know that's difficult to process. Human technology has advanced substantially since your last survey of us. You stopped paying attention, and we kept working. We've been quite busy. Part 4. The Demonstration. Tactical Officer Bren appeared at Thalon's side, speaking in a low, careful voice. Commander, whatever this human vessel is, the technology it represents is significant. If there has been a genuine breakthrough, something the collective scientists haven't yet discovered, we need to examine it. Standard protocol would be to intercept and secure the vessel. Thalon considered this for exactly 3 seconds. It was, strictly speaking, correct. Unknown technological capability was a strategic variable that the collective's doctrine required to be assessed and controlled. A ship that could traverse the broken zone and generate power exceeding a Veltoran flagship warranted detailed study. Deploy 2 cruisers, he ordered. Disable the human vessel and prepare boarding teams. I want Captain Chen brought aboard unharmed. Within minutes, the Verath and the Andral, 2 of the Infinite Reach's support cruisers, each 400 meters long and carrying armament sufficient to reduce a mountain range to dust, separated from the fleet and moved toward the Pathfinder in a careful, practiced approach pattern. On the display, Captain Chen watched the cruisers come without moving from her chair. Her expression was the same as it had been since the beginning of the conversation. Attentive, calm, and carrying that strange quality of patience that Thalon was finding increasingly difficult to interpret. That's an interesting response to an offer of assistance, she said, though I suppose I shouldn't be surprised. Your collective does have something of a reputation for treating unknown variables as threats. She paused. Commander, I'd sincerely ask you to recall those ships. I have no wish to harm anyone, but I will defend the Pathfinder if I have to. You are threatening Veltoran warships, Fallon said. With what precisely? For the first time, something in her expression suggested the faintest shadow of sadness. Not anger, not offense. Sadness, as if this was a conversation she had hoped not to have. I'm not threatening anything, Commander. I'm warning you. There's a difference. Your cruisers won't survive an engagement with my ship, and I genuinely don't want that on my conscience. The cruisers reached engagement range. Their weapons systems came online, charging to full capacity. On the command deck of the Infinite Reach, officers watched their displays with the quiet confidence of professionals who had never had reason to doubt the outcome of a Veltoran military engagement. The cruiser captain's voice came through the open channel. Fire! 8 plasma beams, each one carrying enough destructive energy to level a city district, crossed the distance to the Pathfinder in under a second and struck it simultaneously. Nothing happened. The beams intersected with a field of soft, blue luminescence that materialized precisely at the hull of the human vessel, absorbed the energy completely, and vanished. The Pathfinder floated undisturbed, entirely unscathed. The silence on the command deck was absolute. Increase power, the cruiser captain ordered, his voice betraying just the faintest tremor of uncertainty. Maximum intensity, all weapons systems. What followed was not an attack so much as an obliteration attempt. Both Veltoran cruisers unleashed their complete arsenal simultaneously. Plasma cannons at full charge, missile barrages, kinetic penetrators, directed energy weapons. It was the kind of firepower that was used in extremis against hardened planetary installations. Against a vessel one-tenth the cruiser's size, it should have been devastating beyond any reasonable expectation of survival. The blue field absorbed it all. The Pathfinder didn't even rock. Captain Chen had not moved from her chair. She watched the sustained assault with an expression that, had Thalen been forced to describe it, most resembled someone observing an unusual weather pattern. Mildly interesting, not particularly concerning. "Are you finished?" she asked, when the barrage finally ceased. No one answered. What happened next was something that Thalen would spend considerable time afterward attempting to describe accurately, and would always feel that language was inadequate to the task. The Pathfinder moved. But moved was the wrong word, because movement implies acceleration, a transition from stillness through velocity to a new position. The Pathfinder did none of that. It simply occupied one point in space, and then, without any detectable interval, occupied a different one. It appeared between the two Veltoran cruisers as if it had always been there, and the universe had only just caught up with the fact. "Sir," Crass' voice had dropped to barely above a whisper. The human vessel performed a spatial displacement, instantaneous transit between 2 points. A pause. "That technology is theoretically—" "I know what it is theoretically," Fallon said quietly. From the Pathfinder, beams of white light extended, thin, precise, entirely unlike the broad, destructive instruments of Veltoran weapon systems. They move with a quality that could only be described as deliberate, as though each beam knew exactly where it was going and exactly what it intended to find there. They carved through Veltoran armor with ease, but not through the crew compartments. Around those spaces, the corridors, the living quarters, the emergency shelters where thousands of Veltoran soldiers might be taking cover, the beams curved away with uncanny accuracy, leaving them untouched. In 30 seconds, it was over. Both cruisers drifted, cold and silent, their weapons destroyed, their engines offline, their hulls opened in precise geometric sections. They were rendered entirely helpless. And from every crew compartment, 3,000 Veltoran soldiers were alive and unharmed, floating in the wreckage of ships that had been transformed into elegant, useless sculptures. Not a single life had been lost. The command deck of the Infinite Reach was very quiet. Thalon stood at the center of it and understood, with the clarity that comes only from a direct encounter with something genuinely beyond one's frame of reference, that everything the collective believed about humanity had been wrong. Not slightly wrong, not wrong in the way that intelligence assessments are sometimes wrong, a miscalculation of capability, an underestimate of resources. Wrong in a more fundamental way. Wrong about the nature of the thing itself. Humans were not a minor species advancing slowly toward eventual significance. They were not the footnote that the collective's records had described them as. Something had happened in the 3 centuries since the collective had last bothered to look, and whatever it was, it had produced this. Captain Chen appeared on the display again. Her expression was the same as it had always been. Calm, patient, carrying that quality of old eyes in a young face that Thalan couldn't quite name. "I'm sorry for that," she said. "It wasn't how I would have chosen to proceed. Your crews are unharmed and will need to be recovered, but they'll be fine. I was careful." "What are you?" Phelan asked. It came out less as a command and more as a genuine question. "Human, Commander, nothing more. Humans cannot do what you just did." "Humans could not do what I just did 3 centuries ago," she corrected, gently. "That was a long time. A great deal changed." She stood from her chair and walked toward the camera, and Thalon found himself studying her face with an attention he hadn't given anything in years. She was young, 30 or 40 years old by human reckoning, which was barely an adolescence by Veltoran standards, but her eyes carried something that age alone couldn't account for. the eyes of someone who had seen and understood and was waiting patiently for others to catch up. "Commander, may I say something?" He nodded slowly. "Your collective has been observing humanity for a very long time. You watched our planet from a distance. You monitored our first steps into space, assessed our technology, measured our potential. And then you made a decision, 3 centuries ago, that we were not worth engaging with, not worth contact, not worth attention. You classified us as primitive and turned your instruments toward more interesting subjects." She folded her hands behind her back, a posture, Thalen noticed, that mirrored his own. Intentional, perhaps. "That decision has had consequences that I don't think you fully appreciated at the time." "Explain yourself." "Your species, Commander, and others like yours, civilizations that have traveled the stars for millennia, advance in a particular way, steadily, carefully, along predictable vectors. You improve on what exists. You refine and optimize. You build on foundations laid by previous generations, and the resulting progress is genuine and impressive. I mean that sincerely." She paused. "Humanity advances differently." Talon waited. "When we encounter a problem, we don't accept its existence. We don't work around it or adapt to it. We treat it as a personal affront and dismantle it. When we want something, we don't wait for the universe to provide it. We reach out and take it. When someone tells us that something cannot be done, we treat that as the beginning of the inquiry rather than its conclusion." Something shifted in her expression. Not pride exactly, but a kind of quiet certainty. "We have been called many things by the civilizations we've encountered. Relentless, irrational, dangerously optimistic. We wear all of those as compliments, Commander, because in the 3 centuries since you dismissed us as irrelevant, humanity has advanced faster than your collective has in the past 3,000 years." The silence that followed was different from the earlier silence. Not the stunned quiet after witnessing the impossible, but the deeper quiet of a paradigm shifting. "The technology you've seen today," Chen continued, "is a fraction of what humanity has developed. The Pathfinder is a diplomatic and exploration vessel. It is not a warship. What you witnessed in this engagement was the bare minimum of what we're capable of." She held his gaze steadily. "Behind me stands the full strength of the human fleet, ships that make the Pathfinder look modest, technology that would appear to your scientists to be indistinguishable from phenomena your physics doesn't have the framework to describe yet. Sufficient power, collectively, to end the Krell threat entirely, within weeks." Fallon heard himself say, "And you came here to offer this." "I came here to offer friendship," she said. "The military capability is incidental. It's what we're bringing to the conversation, yes, but it's not what we want from it." "What do you want?" Captain Chen was quiet for a moment. When she spoke again, something in her voice had changed, shed the careful, diplomatic formality, and become simply honest. "We want what we have always wanted, to not be alone, to find our place among the people of this galaxy rather than being watched through a telescope from a respectful distance and quietly decided against. To learn from the civilizations that have come before us and to share what we've learned in return. To help those who need help." She met his gaze with a directness that crossed whatever gap might have existed between their species. "And to be treated as what we are. Not primitives, not subjects of observation. Equals." She let the words stand in the space between them. "In exchange for helping you defeat the Krell, which we intend to do with or without your agreement, because 4 billion lives is not a political consideration for us, we ask only that the Veltoran Collective recognize humanity's place in this galaxy. Not above you, not beneath you, beside you." She did not add, "or else." She didn't need to. Both of them understood the shape of the alternative. Part 6. The Council Decides. 3 hours later, Thalon stood in the emergency council chamber, carved from black stone, brought from the collective's homeworld, 6,000 light-years away. Around the circular table sat the most powerful figures in this sector of space. Fleet Admiral Choros, nearly 8 centuries old, her skin the near white of extreme age, her reputation built on 50 years of tactical victories that were still studied in military academies throughout the collective. Governor Telmar, who administered 16 colony worlds and possessed a political instinct as sharp as any weapon. Strategic Commander Venth, whose experience stretched across 3 centuries of engagements against every threat the Outer Territories had produced. All of them had watched the footage of the disabled cruisers. The hologram had played 3 times at the Admiral's request, and each time it played, the silence around the table became a different kind of silence. "This is fabricated," Admiral Choros said at last. Her voice carried the weight of authority built over centuries, but underneath it, Thalon heard something he had never heard from her before. Doubt. Some form of advanced deception, holographic distortion. The readings must be corrupted. "I had our best scientists examine every sensor record," Thalon said. "The energy signatures are genuine. The spatial displacement occurred. 3,000 crew members recovered from those cruisers can give you eyewitness testimony. The events happened exactly as the recordings show." The silence deepened. "Then how?" Governor Telmar demanded. The color in his skin had shifted. Darker, agitated, the involuntary, physiological response to information that challenged fundamental assumptions. "How does a species we classified as primitive, a species we looked at and dismissed, develop technology that outpaces everything the collective has achieved in 12,000 years? "The captain says her species advances differently," Thalon said. "That they don't accept limitations as fixed, that they push past them." "That's a poet's explanation," Venth said, leaning forward, "not a scientific one." "Perhaps, but the evidence would seem to support it." "What does she want?" Choros asked. "An alliance, recognition of humanity as our equals. She claims they can end the Krell threat within weeks." The laughter that came from around the table was not entirely unkind, but it was reflexive. The sound of minds encountering a concept that bumped against 12,000 years of institutional belief. Equals. The word itself sounded strange in this room. "The Veltoran Collective has not recognized any species as an equal in its entire history," Telmar said. "Then perhaps," Thalon replied quietly, "it's time to consider whether that policy has served us as well as we believed." The laughter stopped. Before the conversation could continue, a chime sounded and Captain Chen appeared in the chamber as a life-sized holographic projection. Calm, professional, exactly as she had been since the beginning. She surveyed the assembled leadership of the Veltoran Collective Sector Command with the composed attention of someone who had been in difficult rooms before and knew how to wait.